Now, most countries across sub-Saharan Africa are adopting a range of approaches to the development of mini-grids, aiming to extend energy access to underserved areas or communities. Existing regulations, however, have often been inadequate to de-risk and finance such investments. This conversation with Jessica Stevens, the CEO, Africa Mini-Grid Developers Association, and Ayo Ademilua, CEO of A4AT Power Solutions, on this weighty subject kicks off today's edition of Focus On.
So right now the sector is still nascent, but ultimately mini-grids are the cheapest, most effective modality to provide stable electricity to the continent. So they are decentralized solutions, so they're able to provide power for remote communities, but the power supply is significantly greater than what you'd get with a solar home system. So they're essentially decentralized infrastructure. With the mini-grids for the companies that we represent, have an SLA or a service level uptime of more than 99%. I mean, they're running productive use, they're running small businesses off the back of them, and so they're really the foundation for building an economy. You look at sort of predictions from the World Bank or the International Energy Agency, and their ranges of the expectations for what mini-grids are going to do in Africa is something like 140,000 mini-grids will connect roughly 250 million people across the continent. I think the EIA's estimate is something like 34% of the unelectrified in Africa are best served by mini-grids. And so right now, we have great practitioners who are looking at expanding in the market. We have amazing businesses who are doing very cool things, but we're not at scale yet. And so getting to that scale and getting from what is early stage or a nascent industry and growing into something that is going to be able to provide that stable electricity supply to the continent is sort of where we're in that growing pains right now. We're like in our preteen years.
Right. And then it's time to bring in Ayo. I think one of the conversations have also been the level of attachment to what some people have termed as traditional grid systems. Is still so present that sometimes it threatens the appetite for support to mini grids. I mean, talk to us a bit about your experience from where you come from.
I mean, what you're saying is true. But you see, what the need is just the right orientation. So I think a lot of campaign has to also be pushed from our side, on the mini-grid side, in educating people about understanding that, hey, mini-grid does not mean lesser power to use. Now, because the misunderstanding that a lot of people usually have is thinking that mini-grid gives you less power, you won't be able to use some of your appliances, you can do the things you do on the national grid, on the mini grid, but this is not true. The only difference between the national grid and the mini grid is that the national grid is cooked in a distance place and is transmitted on a very long distance line. And it gets to the people. But mini grid is centralized and located within the communities in the region. And it's transmitted over shorter lines, which means there is a lot of high efficiency because you're close to your power plant.
Right.
Now, what you find across Africa most of the times is that you find some people in a long distance place that are off the power, and you hear that, 10 kilometers from here, someone had cut our grid. But if it's supposed to be mini grid, your mini grid is within your community. There's nobody caught in the line before getting to you or getting to the next 2 or 3 communities.
Right.
So we need the right orientation and education to push the campaign here to let people know that you get the same kind of volt that you get from national grid on mini grid.
Right. And yes, go ahead. Yes.
I think Ayo said, the only difference is the distance of the transmission lines. The other difference is actually that mini grids are providing 24-hour power.
Exactly.
And we are not getting that from utilities in Africa. I don't know. My experience in Tanzania was very much lots of power cuts. So, they are the stable solution to provide power for education, for healthcare facilities. Every mini grid goes in, and all of them supply power to healthcare facilities, to schools, usually free of cost, or highly subsidized by power.
And if we're talking about this kind of differences and the uniqueness in offering the solution that is much needed now for us to close this energy access gap, why is it or what is it that the members of this Mini-Grid Developers Association are telling you in the sense of the clarion call for regulation? Because a lot of them are still talking about a lot of bottlenecks when they are actually coming to offer these solutions that the two of you are talking about.
I mean, do you want to take this one first?
Okay, I'm going to take this.
Yeah.
Now, the truth about it is also just like you have the people generally a bit back, trying to evaluate, trying to check. Many governments across Africa are also still trying to check and evaluate. Now, don't forget that the beauty of mini grids is that it opens up for private investment into the grid business. And many of the national grids have suffered because there's not enough investment into the national grid anymore. So the mini grid developers want to have policies and regulations that protects their investment.
Correct.
I mean, you and I know what it is to try to do business. You want to do business, you want to be sure that where you're putting your money, you're protected.
Yeah, you're protected.
Not that you've invested, let's say, maybe $1 million, and the next year, someone wakes up and say, hey, I already had a franchise for that area, so please go pack your stuff and put it in your backyard. What are you going to do? Then you also have to get a very good regulation when it comes to tariff. We all know that most of the grid tariffs around Africa are highly subsidized. And most of the time, when they're highly subsidized, they're not really well maintained. So, but private mini grid developers are getting funds, maybe from investors, from banks who want returns, and they want to make sure that whatever they're putting on ground is protected and the tariff makes sense. Because, when you do business, it's about ROI. So there's a need for us to have the regulators in the countries think about the part of your ROI when they're coming up with policies on the tariffs. To say that, hey, we know you guys are in business, at least let's give you tariffs that can make you to have your money back maybe in 10 or 15 years. So where that is not present, it becomes a bottleneck for investment. Oh, you see the people suffering for energy access. We want to close the gap for energy transition. But if the ground is not well cultivated for you,
it will be difficult. And could this be what you said, that there's need for orientation that is proper? Because when you have, the challenges of even licensing, some people taking close to over a year to be able to get...
I mean, over a year in most markets. Nigeria is the fastest moving market on regulation. But the truth is that part of the problem in the regulatory space is that when the regulations were being developed, we were trying to create a slightly lower bar than we have with a PPA agreement. But actually, nobody thought about what it really means to create a decentralized approach to dealing with decentralized energy. And so the structure that currently exists is basically a slightly slimmed down PPA agreement or a PPA structure that you'd get if you were building generation or you were operating as a distributor. And it's not thinking about sort of what are the efficiencies that you can create in the regulatory structure so that we're not trying to create a license for every 100 kilowatts we put in the ground. Right? I mean, can you imagine if the utility in Rwanda made the utility get a license for every 300 connections that they put in the ground? And that's sort of the equivalent that we're talking about in the mini grid space. These companies, they go in, they build 100 kilowatts, 200 kilowatts, 500 kilowatts. They're connecting 100 to 400 or 500 people, and they have a license for that. And then they go to the next community and they have a license for that. And so we need to start seeing efficiencies in how we think about regionalization and portfolio approaches to the regulations. I think regulation is there to protect everybody, right? It's there to protect the consumer, it's there to protect the government, it's there to protect the businesses, and it's there to protect the investors. And right now, the regulatory structures are prohibiting scale, and so they're not providing what is the most essential thing that we can be providing people, which is cheap, stable power.
Right. And if someone was to ask you for your wish list, what do you want?
On the regulatory side or on the financial side? Because I got lots of wishes.
We're going to come to the financial side just a bit, but on the regulation side.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sector is going to have to start looking at how do you group licenses together.
Yeah.
So do you give, and I think this will look different in each market. There's not going to be a silver bullet, but there are markets, I think like in Zambia or Kenya, where you should actually just be providing a concession agreement to develop for a district. You know, the districts are big enough, there's no power system in there, and so it gives you sort of a regionalization that gives you the ability to build mini grids within this location. And as we see a lot more convergence between on-grid and off-grid, as there's grid integration and under-grid mini grids, you know, the regulation just needs to be there to protect to protect everybody, to protect the developer, but to protect the consumer, and make sure that as the utility comes in, there's a structure and framework that ensures that those people maintain stable power supply. Right. But it's really, I think at this point, it's really about making sure that we're licensing a developer for 5 megawatts, 10 megawatts of power in particular regions or districts, depending upon the country layout, that gives them the ability to operate. And that will just provide so much more stability in both the regulatory structure and the ability for investors to come in and feel secure in their investment. Right. So I think really it's like clarity on grid integration, and it's grouping of sites so that these guys, if it takes a year, but you actually are getting a license that allows you to generate, you know, 10 megawatts of power for 40,000 people. Yeah. I don't know if those numbers are right, but like, you know, that makes a huge difference in the ability to operate as opposed to a license for every 300 people, which is what we're doing right now.
Yeah. You mentioned something that everybody wants to hear, and that is financing, money. And there's been a lot of that particular conversation in terms of looking at the holistic investment approaches to actually investing in this kind of solutions. And I want to bring you, I mean, what do you think, in closing, would be the holistic approaches in investing in this kind of solutions?
Wow, that's a big question. What we're looking for as developers, it's for both the government, the DFIs, the donors, to come in with the right type of fund. Not just fund, right type of cost, right tenor. Understanding that this project, number one, is people driven, so there's a need for concessionary funds. Understanding that the returns, if we do not want to kill our people with tariff, you know, will take a long time. So that speaks to the tenor of the funds that will be available commercially. So we want to see, as we evolve from the grant times to the commercial viable funding of those mini grids, a more concessionary and longer tenor funds that are friendly, that are really speaking to us, closing the gap in these energy issues and these climate actions.
Right. How about you, Jessica?
Oh man, finance is so hard. So what I would say is, there are a lot of investors out there who are super interested in the mini grid market. You can see the potential of the market. You know, I think there's the revenue potential and the investment potential in Africa is huge within the context of this sector. I think right now, every single person on this planet, outside of the poorest people in the world in Africa, have subsidized energy. When I live in France, like when I get power to my house in France, it's subsidized, you know, and you see that for, you know, a farmer in Texas, or you see that all over the globe. And what we've sort of structured, because of this concern about funding private sector, is we've structured the mini grid market as a way to say we're going to make the end user, the consumer, bear the cost burden of electrification. And so the way that we shift that burden off of the end consumer isn't by squeezing the investors, and it's not by squeezing the companies, which is what's happening right now. It's by actually unlocking all of this concessional capital that's been committed to the sector. So we have $1.6 billion between the major donors and DFIs in the space that have been committing capital to the mini grid market since 2014. The Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet has committed an additional $1.5 billion to support energy access, mostly through mini grids, is at least our understanding of these announcements. And right now, what the developers that I represent, which is most of the developers on the continent, we've seen about $60 million in concessional capital hit developers in the last 6 years. And so we have huge promises, and we have really low deployment rates.